There is a street in the German town of Hamelin where music is forbidden. Even today, 7 centuries later, no drum may beat, no pipe may play, and no laughter is allowed to echo against the timber-framed walls of the Bungelosenstrasse. It is a street of eternal mourning, a scar carved into the cobblestones that refuses to heal. If you stand there long enough, when the wind comes down from the surrounding hills and touches the surface of the river Weser, you might feel the weight of a silence that is not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of a terrible memory. It is the memory of a summer morning in 1284, when the future simply walked away. History is usually a record of battles, of kings crowned and treaties signed in ink. But the true history of humanity is written in the things that are lost. It is written in the empty cradle, the unspun wool, and the chair left vacant at the supper table. We often speak of the Pied Piper as a fairy tale, a nursery rhyme meant to frighten disobedient children into sleep. We imagine a colorful figure in a storybook, leading rodents to the water. But the archives of Hamelin tell a different, far darker story. They do not speak of magic, but of a specific date, June 26, the day of Saints John and Paul. They do not speak of a myth, but of a census that suddenly, violently, dropped by 130 souls. Imagine the dawn of that day. The sun rising over a prosperous merchant town, the smell of baking bread and the damp river air. The parents of Hamelin were busy with their commerce, secure in their wealth, confident that their debts could go unpaid without consequence. They believed that a bargain made with a stranger could be broken because they held the power. They did not understand that there are forces in this world, ancient, rhythmic, and vengeance-driven, that do not abide by the laws of merchants. They did not know that a promise broken to the wrong entity requires a payment far costlier than gold. 130 children, an entire generation, gone within the span of a single melody. They did not vanish into the air. They walked, with eyes wide and hearts ensnared, into the hollow of a mountain, or perhaps into the vast unknown of the East. What remains is only the inscription on an old house and the stained glass light of a church window, long since destroyed, which once whispered the truth of the tragedy. This is not a story of rats. It is a story of the terrifying price of greed, and the song that calls us to follow, even when we know we should not. The candle is lit, and the archives are open. If you wish to walk the silent streets of 1284 and uncover the truth behind the melody, stay with us in the shadows. Chapter 1: The City of Gold and Grain. To understand the silence, one must first listen to the noise. Before the sorrow, Hamelin was not a graveyard of memory, but a cacophony of ambition. In the late 13th century, the Kingdom of Hanover was a tapestry of feudal shadows and rising stone, and Hamelin sat upon the banks of the river Weser like a jewel fastened tightly to a beggar's cloak. It was a town built on the certainty of grain and the solidity of walls. The year is 1284, a time when the Holy Roman Empire stretches its vast, chaotic limbs across Europe. But here, in this pocket of Lower Saxony, the world feels small, contained, and infinitely secure. The sun rises over the Weser hills, casting long, golden fingers across the timber-framed houses, illuminating the dust that hangs perpetually in the air, the dust of flour, of dried mud, and of commerce. Can you smell it? The air here is thick and sweet. It smells of yeast rising in 1,000 ovens, of ale fermenting in oak barrels, and of the wet, earthen scent of the river that flows sluggishly past the docks. Hamelin is a mill town, a market town, a place where the grinding stone never truly stops. The river is not merely water. It is a vein of silver that turns the wheels and carries the barges, heavy with sacks of wheat and rye, down toward the sea. The citizens of Hamelin, the burghers in their velvet doublets and the millers in their flour-dusted tunics, walk these cobblestones with the heavy, confident step of men who believe they have conquered want. They look at the high stone walls that encircle their homes and see an impenetrable barrier against the chaos of the wild woods and the bandit roads. They believe that stone and gold are the only gods worth praying to, for stone keeps out the cold, and gold keeps out the hunger. Prosperity, however, is often a blinding light. When a city grows fat on its own success, it develops a kind of myopia, a short-sightedness that mistakes comfort for permanence. The fathers of Hamelin sit in the council hall, their fingers stained with ink and grease, tallying the season's harvest. They argue over tariffs and tolls, over the price of lumber and the weight of a loaf. They are practical men, men of ledgers and scales. To them, the world is a series of transactions. Everything has a price and everything can be bought: safety, loyalty, even salvation. They attend Mass at the Church of St. Boniface, kneeling on cushions to spare their knees, murmuring prayers that are more like negotiations with the Almighty than confessions of the soul. They thank God for the harvest, but in their hearts they credit their own cleverness. But listen closer to the sounds of the city. Beneath the shouting of the merchants and the rumble of the cartwheels, there is a subtle hardening of the spirit. A town that worships the granary eventually forgets the sanctity of the empty hand. Charity in Hamelin has become a performance, a few coins tossed in the dirt to keep the beggars from blocking the path to the market. The parents of this town look at their children, 130 of them, running through the alleys with hoops and balls, and they see them not just as souls to be nurtured, but as heirs to be managed. They are the future possessors of the ledger, the next hands to hold the keys to the warehouse. The children are well fed, dressed in fine wool, their cheeks flushed with the health that only abundant grain can provide. They are the crowning jewels of Hamelin's wealth. And like all jewels, they are guarded with possessiveness, but perhaps not with understanding. Walk with me now, away from the bustling market square, into the deeper, quieter veins of the town. The alleys here are narrow, the upper stories of the houses leaning toward each other as if sharing secrets across the cobblestones. The light filters down in dusty shafts, illuminating the mundane details of a Tuesday in the 13th century. A woman sweeps her doorstep with a broom made of birch twigs. A blacksmith hammers a horseshoe, the rhythmic clang-clang-clang acting as the city's heartbeat. A cat stretches on a windowsill, watching the street with lazy, golden eyes. Everything is in its place. Order is the religion of Hamelin. Even the shadows seem regulated, cast by the midday sun with geometric precision. Yet there is a fragility to this order that goes unnoticed. Look at the granaries, those towering wooden cathedrals where the wealth of the harvest sleeps. They are packed tight, floor to ceiling, with the golden yield of the summer. To the councilmen, this is security. But to nature, this is an invitation. A city that hoards is a city that beckons. The very abundance that makes Hamelin proud is the beacon that will summon its first tormentor. We often think of disaster as a sudden storm or a marching army. But disaster can also be small, furred, and driven by a hunger that mirrors the greed of the men it targets. The burghers of Hamelin do not yet see the eyes watching from the cellars and the sewers. They do not hear the scratching behind the wainscoting. They are too busy counting. In the counting houses, the coins clink against each other, silver pennies, heavy and dull. The sound is seductive. It drowns out the warnings of the priests who speak of humility. It drowns out the intuitive dread that the mothers feel when the twilight lingers a little too long. The town has forgotten that it exists within a larger, wilder world, a world of forests and mountains where ancient laws still hold sway. They have built walls of stone to keep out the wolves, but they have built no walls to keep out the consequences of their own nature. Consider the mayor. He is a man of girth and velvet, his face ruddy with wine and authority. He sits at the head of the table in the rat house, the town hall, surrounded by his advisors. They are discussing the expansion of the Eastern Wall, the taxation of the wool trade. They speak of perpetuity, of building a legacy that will last for 1,000 years. It is the supreme arrogance of the medieval mind, the belief that the present moment can be frozen in stone. They do not know that their legacy will not be built of stone, but of silence. They do not know that the very children playing beneath the window of the rat house are the currency with which they will pay for their blindness. As the sun begins to dip, painting the Weser in hues of bruised purple and blood orange, a wind picks up. It rustles the leaves of the linden trees in the churchyard. It is a cool wind carrying the scent of the distant mountains, the Koppenberg hills that loom like sleeping giants on the horizon. The wind passes through the market, scattering the chaff, and for a moment, just a moment, the noise of the town falters. A dog barks at nothing. A shutter bangs against a wall. The parents call their children inside, their voices sharp, cutting through the dusk. "Come in," they say. "It is getting dark." They lock their doors. They slide the heavy iron bolts into place. They stir the fires in their hearths and sit down to tables laden with roasted meats and soft bread. They are safe. They are rich. They are the masters of their domain. But outside, in the gathering dark, the balance is shifting. The city of gold and grain has tipped the scales. The surplus of grain has called the rats, and the surplus of greed will call the piper. The stage is set, the actors are in place, and the first act of the tragedy is about to begin. The silence of the future is waiting, just beyond the closed door, listening to the laughter of the children who will not grow old. Chapter 2: The Plague of Teeth. It begins not with a roar, but with a rustle. A sound so soft it might be mistaken for the settling of old timber or the wind brushing dry leaves against the stone. But in the deep silence of the Hamelin night, the sound grows. It multiplies. It is the friction of fur against wood, the clicking of claws on cobblestone, the frenetic, ceaseless gnawing of hunger made manifest. The security of the town, those high walls and locked doors, was designed to keep out men with swords. It was never designed to keep out an enemy that can pour itself like water through a crack in the cellar foundation. The rats do not knock, they seep. They rise from the riverbanks and the sewers, drawn by the scent of the grain that Hamelin has so proudly hoarded. Imagine the horror of the first realization. A baker goes to his flour sacks in the gray pre-dawn light, expecting the clean white dust of his trade, and finds instead a writhing gray mass. The sack moves, it breathes, it screams with 1,000 high-pitched voices. The grain is gone, replaced by the warm, living bodies of the swarm. This is not an infestation, it is a displacement. The rats have come to claim the city. They are the black rats, ratus ratus, agile climbers, intelligent and relentless. They are the shadows of the human condition, thriving where we thrive, eating what we eat, mirroring our own gluttony with a terrifying purity of purpose. The plague of teeth descends upon the city with the force of a biblical curse. They are in the larders devouring the winter hams. They are in the wardrobes shredding the fine linens to build their nests. They act with a collective intelligence, a hive mind driven by a metabolism that burns like a furnace. They must eat, and they must eat constantly. Nothing is sacred. They scurry across the altars of St. Boniface, leaving their droppings on the communion cloth. They invade the cradles, forcing mothers to stand vigil over their sleeping infants with broom handles and lanterns, terrified that the soft skin of a child might be mistaken for sustenance. The sanctity of the home is violated. There is no private space left in Hamelin, no corner where the scratch and chitter of the enemy cannot be heard. It is a siege without armies. The burghers who felt so powerful in their council chambers now find themselves utterly impotent. What good is gold against a rat? You cannot bribe a rodent. You cannot threaten it with excommunication or taxes. The town's cats, usually the prowling lions of the alleyways, are overwhelmed. They retreat to the rooftops, hissing and wide-eyed, outnumbered 100 to 1. The dogs, bred for hunting, are bitten and harassed until they cower under the tables. The animal kingdom has been upended. The prey has become the predator through the sheer, overwhelming weight of numbers. The streets of Hamelin, once kept clean by civic pride, now undulate with gray waves. Desperation drives men to strange bargains. The council meets daily now, but the air of arrogance is gone, replaced by the sour smell of sweat and fear. The mayor slams his fist on the table, demanding solutions, but his voice cracks. They have tried poison, but the rats breed faster than they can die. They have tried traps, but the traps are choked with bodies within the hour. They have tried prayer, organizing solemn processions through the streets, carrying relics and chanting psalms, but the rats merely scurry between the feet of the priests, mocking the holy rituals with their profane existence. The citizens look to their leaders for salvation, and seeing only impotence, their respect turns to anger. A mob gathers outside the rat house, their shouts competing with the squealing of the vermin. "Do something," they scream. "Save our food, save our children." It is in this climate of exhaustion and hysteria that the city becomes vulnerable to the impossible. When rational means fail, the mind turns to the irrational. The town is ready to believe in magic because reality has become a nightmare. They are ready to pay any price to make the noise stop. The grain is disappearing at an alarming rate. The wealth of Hamelin, its pride and its future, is being digested by 1 million tiny stomachs. The specter of famine, once a distant rumor, now stands at the city gates. The golden summer has turned into a gray, gnawing autumn. The rats are not just eating the food, they are eating the city's hope. And so Hamelin waits. It waits for a miracle or a savior. It does not care where the savior comes from. It does not care if he comes from God or the devil, as long as he brings silence. The town fathers, desperate to hold on to their power, authorize a reward, a massive sum, 1,000 guilders. It is a fortune, enough to buy a lordship, enough to build a castle. They post the proclamation on the doors of the rat house, desperate for anyone, mercenary, magician, or madman, to take up the challenge. They do not think about the cost. They only think about the relief. They are writing a blank check to fate, unaware that the ink they are using is not gold but blood. The sun sets on a city under occupation. The shadows lengthen, and with the dark comes the renewed surge of activity. The rats emerge from their daytime hiding spots, a tidal wave of fur and teeth. The sound rises again, a crescendo of chewing and scratching. In the nurseries, mothers clutch their bobbies tighter. In the counting houses, the men stare at the diminishing piles of coin. And somewhere, out on the dark road leading to the city gates, a figure is walking. He is not hurrying. He moves with the casual, confident stride of a man who knows he is expected. He hears the squealing of the city from miles away, and he smiles. He adjusts the instrument at his belt. He wears a coat of many colors, a patchwork of bright, jarring hues that seem to vibrate against the gray landscape. He is the answer to their prayers and the architect of their doom. The plague of teeth has prepared the way for the plague of silence. Chapter 3. The Stranger in the Multicolored Coat. On the morning of the visitation of the Blessed Virgin, when the heat lay upon the valley like a wet wool blanket, the stranger arrived. He did not come with a fanfare of trumpets, nor did he ride a war horse clad in iron. He stepped out of the heat haze on the road from the south, walking with a cadence that suggested he was marching to a rhythm only he could hear. To the guards at the Ostrider gate, leaning heavily on their spears and swatting at flies, he must have appeared first as a hallucination, a trick of the light and the dust. In a city that had been reduced to the monochrome grays of fear and the brown filth of infestation, he was a violent, jarring riot of color. They called him the Buntling, the Pied One. His coat was a masterpiece of patchwork chaos, a garment that defied the sumptuary laws of the time, which dictated that men dress according to their station. One half of him was dressed in yellow, sharp as the midday sun, the other in red, deep as arterial blood. It was a coat fashioned from the scraps of 100 different lives, stitched together with a precision that bordered on the unnatural. He wore a hat of felt, tall and pointed, adorned with a single feather that twitched in the stagnant air. He was tall, gaunt, and angular, his limbs moving with the fluid, predatory grace of a spider navigating its web. His face was weather-beaten, the skin pulled tight over high cheekbones, his eyes burning with a pale, luminous intelligence that seemed to dissect the soul of anyone who dared to meet his gaze. As he walked through the market square, a strange phenomenon occurred. The noise of the city, that ceaseless, grinding hum of misery, faltered. People stopped in their tracks. The fishmonger let his knife hang in the air. The washerwoman lowered her basket. They stared at him not with the curiosity one offers a traveler, but with the unease one feels in the presence of an omen. There was an aura of otherness about him, a static charge that raised the hair on the arms. He did not look like a Christian soul. He looked like a creature that had slipped through the cracks of the folklore they whispered in the dark, stepping boldly into the daylight. And the rats, even the plague of teeth seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. As the piper's shadow passed over the cobblestones, the vermin paused in their scavenging. They lifted their snouts, whiskers trembling, tasting the air. They did not scatter in panic, not yet, but they froze, held by a sudden instinctual caution. The predator had entered the ecosystem, and the prey in their millions felt the temperature drop. The piper ignored them. He ignored the people. He walked in a straight line, his boots clicking softly on the stones, heading unerringly toward the seat of power. Inside the council chamber, the air was thick with the smell of stale wine and unwashed bodies. The mayor and his aldermen sat slumped in their high-backed chairs, a tableau of defeated authority. The scratching of the rats behind the oak paneling was a constant, mocking accompaniment to their silence. When the doors opened and the stranger entered, he brought with him a gust of wind that seemed to smell of ozone and distant rain. He did not bow. He did not remove his hat. He stood before them, a gaunt exclamation point in a room full of rounded sentences. His eyes, pale and unblinking, swept over the men of Hamelin with a dispassionate curiosity, as if he were inspecting livestock at a fair. "I hear," the stranger said, his voice a soft rasp that carried effortlessly to the back of the room, "that you have a problem with guests who will not leave." He did not shout, yet the scratching in the walls seemed to pause at the sound of his voice. The mayor, rallying the shreds of his dignity, leaned forward. "We are besieged, stranger. Our grain is eaten. Our sleep is broken. Can you help us?" The piper smiled, a thin stretching of lips that did not quite reach his eyes. He reached out and touched the flute at his belt with long, spider-like fingers. "I have freed the Cam of Tartary from his beetles," he said, casually listing feats that sounded like madness. "I have sung the vampires out of the crypts of Hungary. A few rats are of no consequence to me." "Name your price," the mayor said, desperate to end the conversation, desperate to believe. The piper paused. He looked around the room, taking the measure of their velvet doublets and the gold rings on their fingers. 1,000 guilders, he said. The room gasped. 1,000 guilders. It was an exorbitant sum, a king's ransom for a day's work, but the mayor did not hesitate. He was doing the mental arithmetic of a merchant. 1,000, the mayor cried, throwing his hands up in a theatrical gesture. "We will give you 50,000 if you rid us of this scourge. Do the work and the treasury is yours." It was a lie, of course. A promise made in the heat of desperation, easily discarded once the danger has passed. 1,000 will suffice, the piper said quietly. "But understand this, a bargain struck with me is bound by laws older than your statutes. I do the work, you pay the price. There is no negotiation after the first note is played." The councilmen nodded eagerly, bobbing their heads like marionettes. "Yes, yes, of course," they murmured. They were not listening to the warning. They were only hearing the promise of silence. The piper turned on his heel, his multicolored coat swirling around him like a kaleidoscope. He walked out of the chamber without a backward glance. The door closed, leaving the council alone with the scratching in the walls. For a moment there was relief. They had done something. They had hired a specialist. They did not realize that by inviting the piper into their city, they had traded a plague of the body for a plague of the soul. Chapter 4: The Song of the River. The sun had not yet risen. The sky over Hamelin was the color of a bruised plum, suspending the city in that breathless, gray interval between the dream and the waking world. It is in this twilight that the boundary between the possible and the impossible is thinnest. The streets were empty, save for the piper. He stood in the center of the market square, a solitary figure etched against the backdrop of the sleeping timber houses. The only movement was the twitching of the single feather in his hat, stirred by a wind that blew at ground level, carrying the damp, earthen scent of the river. He did not look at the windows where the citizens hid behind their shutters. He looked down at the cobblestones, as if reading a map inscribed in the dirt. He raised the flute to his lips. It was not a gesture of performance, but of operation, precise, mechanical, and devoid of emotion. He took a breath, expanding his gaunt chest, and blew. The sound that emerged was not a melody in the way we understand music. It was not a tune you could hum or dance to. It was a high, shrill trill, a vibration that seemed to bypass the ear and resonate directly in the marrow of the bone. To the human ear, it was merely an annoyance, a mosquito whine that set the teeth on edge. But to the creatures hiding in the dark, it was a command. It was a frequency that spoke the ancient, forgotten language of hunger and migration. It tapped into the biological imperative of the rodent brain, overriding the instinct for self-preservation with a singular, overwhelming compulsion. Follow. At first there was only the sound of the flute piercing the morning air. Then the city began to shudder. It started as a vibration in the soles of the pipers' boots. The earth beneath Hamelin groaned. From the cellars, from the attics, from the hollow spaces beneath the floorboards they came. A trickle at first, a few brave scouts scurrying into the light, their noses twitching, their black eyes fixed on the man in the motley coat. Then the trickle became a stream, and the stream became a torrent. They poured out of the drain pipes like black water. They erupted from the sewers, pushing aside the heavy iron grates with the sheer force of their collective mass. The sheer scale of the infestation was finally revealed in the gray light of dawn. It was a carpet of living fur, a moving tapestry of gray and black that obliterated the cobblestones. There were rats as big as cats, scarred veterans of the alley wars. There were nursing mothers dragging their bellies. There were pink, hairless newborns carried in the mouths of their kin. They did not attack. They did not bite. They surged toward the piper with a terrifying, single-minded devotion, swirling around his boots like a whirlpool. He stood in the center of the storm, playing his shrill, repetitive song, stepping high and rhythmic, lifting his knees like a stork wading through a marsh. He turned his back on the rat house and began to walk. He did not head toward the gates that led to the open fields. He headed west, toward the Weser. The rats followed. It was a procession of the damned, a grotesque parody of a pilgrimage. The sound of their claws on the stone was louder than the rushing of the river, a dry, scuttling roar that echoed off the walls of the silent houses. Inside those houses, the people of Hamelin pressed their ears to the doors, trembling. They heard the exodus. They heard the enemy leaving. But they also heard the music, and for a moment they felt a strange, inexplicable tug in their own chests, a desire to open the door, to see, to follow. They resisted, held back by fear and the bolts of iron, leaving only the beasts to answer the call. The piper moved through the narrow streets, weaving a path that gathered every straggler. He passed the bakeries, now empty of thieves. He passed the granaries, now silent. He was cleansing the city, drawing the poison out of its veins and leading it toward the cure. But the cure was not gentle. The song shifted pitch as he approached the docks, becoming deeper, more rhythmic, pulsing like the heartbeat of a drowning man. The river appeared before them, wide and dark, swollen with the spring rains. The water churned, indifferent to the drama unfolding on its banks. The piper stepped onto the wooden planks of the pier, walking to the very edge where the land ended and the abyss began. He did not stop playing. The song reached a crescendo, a piercing shriek that demanded absolute obedience. They did not hesitate at the precipice. The instinct for survival, that ancient, hardwired drive to avoid the abyss, had been surgically excised by the melody. The front rank of the swarm reached the edge of the pier and simply poured over into the void, pushed not by physical force, but by the crushing weight of the thousands behind them and the irresistible pull of the song before them. It was a waterfall of fur and flesh, a gray cascade tumbling into the dark, swirling waters of the Weser. The river, cold and indifferent, accepted the offering. For a moment the surface of the water boiled. It was a frantic, churning stew of desperate swimming, of claws scrabbling against wet wood, of tiny, high-pitched gasps for air. But the current of the Weser is deceptive. It looks lazy on the surface but pulls with the strength of a millstone beneath. The rats, heavy with the grain they had stolen, were dragged down. The water filled their lungs, extinguishing the hunger that had defined their existence. The sound of the splashing faded, replaced by the deep, gurgling swallow of the river. One by one, the gray heads bobbed and vanished. The black water smoothed over them, sealing the grave. Within minutes, the thousands that had terrorized the city were nothing more than drift, carried north toward the sea, returned to the mud from which all life crawls. The piper lowered his flute. The shrill note cut off abruptly, leaving a silence that felt sudden and violent. He stood at the end of the pier, looking down at the swirling eddies. He did not smile. He did not cheer. He merely wiped the mouthpiece of his instrument on his sleeve and slid it back into his belt. To him, this was not a miracle. It was a transaction completed. He was a craftsman who had finished his labor, a cleaner who had swept the floor. He watched the river for a long moment, his face unreadable, his motley coat flapping gently in the breeze that rose off the water. Then the bells of St. Boniface began to ring. The doors of the houses burst open. The citizens, seeing the empty streets and the rat-free gutters, poured out into the morning light. The fear that had paralyzed them for months evaporated instantly, replaced by a delirious, almost manic relief. They ran to the riverbank. They hugged one another in the streets. "They are gone," the cry went up. "The plague is ended." It is a peculiar trait of human nature that we forget our desperation the moment the danger has passed. The humility of the siege vanished. The prayers of the night before were forgotten. In the bright light of day, the burghers of Hamelin stood tall again. And when they finally turned their eyes to the solitary figure standing on the dock, they did not see a savior anymore. They saw a vagrant in a ridiculous coat. They saw a creditor. Chapter 5. The Broken Oath. The euphoria of deliverance is a potent wine, but it sours quickly into arrogance. By noon, the sun stood high and triumphant over Hamelin, bleaching the memory of the gray dawn. The river flowed innocently, hiding its dead, and the streets were filled not with the scuttle of vermin but with the clatter of commerce returning to life. The marketplace, so recently a theater of despair, was now a festival of relief. But in the cool, stone belly of the rat house, the atmosphere was shifting from gratitude to calculation. The mayor and his council sat around the heavy oak table, the remains of a celebratory feast spread before them. They wiped grease from their chins and looked at one another with the self-satisfied expressions of men who believe they have cheated fate. When the heavy doors creaked open, the laughter died. The piper stood on the threshold. He had not changed. The dust of the road was still on his boots. The motley coat still vibrated with its jarring colors against the gloom of the hall. He did not bow. He did not smile. He simply walked to the head of the table, his spurs clinking softly in the silence, and extended a long, calloused hand. He said nothing. He did not need to. The gesture was universal. The work is done. The debt is due. The mayor leaned back in his chair, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. The fear that had loosened their purse strings the day before had evaporated with the rats. Now, looking at this gaunt, travel-worn figure, they saw only a vagrant with a whistle. The 1,000 guilders, that king's ransom they had so eagerly promised, suddenly seemed like a grotesque overpayment. Why should a man be made rich for an hour's work? Why should the city's treasury be emptied for a bit of music? 1,000 guilders, the mayor mused aloud, as if testing the weight of the words. He chuckled, a wet, rattling sound deep in his throat. "My good man, surely you understood that we spoke in jest, a figure of speech born of the moment's anxiety." He gestured vaguely at the air. "We are grateful, truly. You have done the city a service, but let us be reasonable. 1,000 guilders is the price of an army, not a tune." The piper's hand did not waver. His eyes, pale and unblinking, fixed upon the mayor's face with a terrifying intensity. It was the look of a predator watching prey that has not yet realized it is trapped. "I deal in absolutes," the piper said softly. "The rats are gone. The price was named. The bond was sealed." The councilmen shifted in their seats. The treasurer cleared his throat, pushing a small leather purse across the table. It landed with a light, pitiful thud. "Here are 50 guilders," the treasurer said, his voice trembling slightly under the piper's gaze. "Take it. Buy yourself a new coat. Drink to your health. It is more gold than a wanderer like you sees in a lifetime." 50 guilders, a pittance, an insult thrown like a bone to a dog. The piper did not look at the purse. He did not blink. The silence in the room stretched, taut as a bowstring. The air seemed to drop in temperature, the candles flickering though there was no wind. The ingratitude of Hamelin was not merely a breach of contract. It was a violation of the ancient laws of hospitality and honor. They were treating a supernatural intervention as a transaction at a fish market, trying to haggle with forces they did not comprehend. "You refuse?" the piper asked. His voice was no longer a rasp, it was the sound of dry leaves sliding over a tombstone. "Refuse?" The mayor stood up, his face reddening with the indignation of a man caught in a wrong but refusing to admit it. "We offer you charity. You should be whipped for your insolence. Who are you anyway? A sorcerer? A necromancer? Perhaps you brought the rats yourself just to extort us." The accusation hung in the air, ugly and convenient. "Take the 50 and leave, or we will have the guards throw you in the dungeon for witchcraft." The piper looked at the leather purse lying on the table. He did not touch it. To him, the 50 guilders were not currency, they were a measurement of the soul of Hamelin. They were the physical weight of the city's dishonesty. He looked from the gold to the mayor, his face composing itself into a mask of terrifying serenity. There was no rage in his demeanor, no shouting, no stamping of feet. Anger is a human emotion, hot and messy. What the piper felt was something colder, something elemental, the inevitable recoil of a law that has been broken. "You have chosen," the piper said. His voice was barely a whisper, yet it seemed to extinguish the candles in the sconces on the wall. "You believe that a promise is a thing of air to be spoken and forgotten. You believe that because the rats are dead, the debt is dead. But I tell you this, the debt remains, and if you will not pay me with the gold of your treasury, I will take my payment in a currency you hold far dearer." He did not elaborate. He did not explain. He simply turned his back on the power of Hamelin. The councilmen, emboldened by his lack of violence, began to laugh. "Go on," the mayor shouted after him. "Take your whistle and charm the fleas from the dogs." They drank deep, toasting their own cleverness. They did not see the shadow that stretched out from the piper's heels as he crossed the threshold, a shadow that seemed to linger on the stone long after his body had passed. Outside, the market square was bathed in the golden, deceitful light of the afternoon. The piper walked through the crowds of celebrating citizens. They mocked him as he passed. "Where are your rats, Buntling?" they jeered. The children, the very children he had saved from starvation, mimicked his stride, laughing at his strange, angular gait. He looked at them. He looked at the flushed, healthy faces of the youth of Hamelin. He looked at the boys playing with wooden swords and the girls braiding flowers into their hair. His gaze was not angry, it was appraising. It was the gaze of a man counting a different kind of coin. He reached the city gates, the Ostrider, and paused. He turned back one last time to look at the skyline of Hamelin. He raised a hand, pointing a single, long finger at the heart of the town. It was a gesture of binding, a silent seal placed upon a warrant of execution. Then he stepped out onto the road, vanishing into the heat haze and the dust. The sun set. The town of Hamelin slept the deep, heavy sleep of the gluttonous. They believed the transaction was finished. They believed they had won. But in the silence of the night, the wind shifted. It blew from the east, carrying a chill that had no business in June. The broken oath hung over the city like a sword suspended by a single hair. The piper had gone, but he had left his promise behind. And unlike the men of Hamelin, the piper kept his word. Chapter 6. The Day of Saints. Time in the medieval world is not marked by clocks but by saints. It is a calendar of bones and martyrdom where every sunrise belongs to a holy name. The date is June 26, the feast of Saints John and Paul. It is a day of midsummer heat, when the air over Lower Saxony hangs heavy and still, thick with the drone of insects and the scent of drying hay. The year is 1284. It has been weeks since the rats vanished into the Weser, and the town of Hamelin has settled back into its comfortable rhythm of commerce and piety. The guilt of the broken oath has been buried under layers of self-justification, smoothed over like the dirt on a fresh grave. It is 7 o'clock in the morning. The sun is already bright, bleaching the colors of the timber-framed houses. The streets are strangely quiet. The adults of Hamelin, the merchants, the bakers, the councilmen who laughed at the piper, are all gathered within the cool stone walls of the church of St. Boniface. They are there to perform their weekly penance, to kneel on the flagstones and chant the liturgy. Listen to them. Their voices rise in a droning unison, a low murmur of Latin that suffocates the air inside the nave. They pray for prosperity. They pray for long lives. They do not look out the stained glass windows. They do not see the shadow that has just fallen across the market square. The stranger has returned, but he is no longer the buntling, the motley fool in the coat of many colors. That guise was for the rats, a chaotic mirror for a chaotic plague. Today he wears the clothes of a hunter. He is dressed in grim, travel-stained gray, the color of a storm cloud. Upon his head he wears a hat of strange, terrifying red, the color of dried blood or perhaps the color of a judge's robe. His face is terrible in its calmness. There is no smile now, no twinkle of the trickster. He moves with the solemnity of an executioner who takes no pleasure in his work, but who will not be stayed from it. He stands in the center of the town, exactly where he stood before. But this time he does not face the river. He faces the houses. He faces the nurseries, the bedrooms, the courtyards where the youth of Hamelin have been left behind while their parents pray. He unhooks the flute from his belt. It is the same instrument, yet as he raises it to his lips, the light catches it differently, making it gleam like a bone. He takes a breath, a long, slow intake of the morning air, and he begins to play. The sound that emerges is not the shrill, piercing shriek that drove the vermin to madness. It is something else entirely. It is a sound that sits just below the threshold of adult hearing, a frequency of pure, unadulterated longing. To the few adults who might have been lingering outside, the sick, the elderly, it is nothing more than the wind sighing in the eaves. But to the children, it is a thunderclap of joy. It is a melody that speaks directly to the restless spirit of youth. It sings of a land where there are no chores, no ledgers, no stern fathers counting coins. It sings of a world that is green and wild and free. It is the song of the open door. Inside the church, the priest raises the host. The bells ring, masking the world outside. The parents bow their heads, closing their eyes in performative reverence. They are walled in by their own stone and their own noise. They are deaf to the theft that is taking place in their own homes. They believe they are safe in the house of God, unaware that the devil is walking through their gardens, and he is playing the sweetest song their children have ever heard. It begins with the unlatching of a door, a small sound, sharp and distinct in the quiet street, then another, then the squeal of a rusted hinge, then the slap of bare feet on stone. From the houses of the rich and the hovels of the poor they come. The children of Hamelin emerge not with the chaotic energy of play, but with the synchronized, fluid movement of a flock of birds turning in the sky. They are in a trance, their eyes wide and fixed on a horizon that only they can see. The baker's daughter leaves the dough rising on the counter. The blacksmith's apprentice drops his hammer. The mayor's son, dressed in his velvet Sunday best, walks out of the heavy oak doors of his father's house, leaving them wide open to the street. There are 130 of them, a generation, a river of white tunics and flushed faces flowing toward the market square. They do not speak to one another. There is no laughter, no shouting. There is only the sound of the music and the soft, rhythmic patter of hundreds of feet. It is a terrifying sight, this silent rebellion, this mass sleepwalking. They are leaving their lives behind without a backward glance. They are leaving the toys carved by their fathers, the dolls stitched by their mothers, the futures mapped out for them in the ledgers of the town. They are shedding the weight of their parents' expectations like a heavy winter coat in the first heat of spring. The piper does not stop to greet them. He does not turn to count his flock. He knows they are there. He can feel the weight of their attention pressing against his back. He continues to play that strange, silvery melody and he begins to walk. He heads toward the Ostrider, the eastern gate, the mouth of the city that opens onto the wild road. He moves with a long, loping stride and the children follow. They press close to him, drawn like moths to a flame, yet they never touch him. There is a circle of empty space around the hunter in the red hat, a holy or unholy ground that cannot be crossed. Inside the church, the Mass is ending. The priest intones the Ite Missa Est, go, the Mass is ended. The adults rise, their knees stiff, their souls cleansed for another week of commerce. They file out into the sunlight, blinking, expecting to hear the usual noise of the town. But they step out into a vacuum. The silence hits them first. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of absence. It is the hollow, ringing emptiness of a room where a clock has stopped ticking. The women look toward the nurseries. The men look toward the workshops. The doors are open. The tools are dropped. The cradles are cold. "Where are they?" a mother asks. Her voice is small, fragile. "Where is Hans? Where is Greta?" Panic travels faster than the plague. It ripples through the crowd, turning the postmass lethargy into hysteria. They run to the gates. They see the dust settling on the road to the east. They see the small footprints stamped into the soft earth, hundreds of them, all pointing away from the city, all pointing toward the mountains. And far in the distance, carried on the wind, they hear the last fading notes of a flute, a sound that is no longer a promise but a taunt. The day of saints has become the day of loss. The hunt is over, and the hunter is taking his trophies home. Chapter 7. The Mountain That Opened. The road from the Osterter gate winds eastward, cutting through the fields of barley and rye that the parents of Hamelin had worked so hard to protect. It is a road of hard-packed earth, usually crowded with carts and cattle, but today it serves a singular, terrifying purpose. It has become a processional aisle for the lost. The sun beats down on the backs of the 130 children, baking the dust into a fine, choking powder that hangs in the air like a golden curtain. Through this haze, they move. They do not run. They do not skip. They walk with a fluid, unified rhythm, their feet striking the ground in time with the piper's melody. It is a sight that defies the natural disorder of childhood. No one lags behind, no one strays to pick a flower, no one cries out for water. They are a single organism, a river of white tunics and flaxen hair flowing uphill against the gradient of reason. The piper leads them. He does not tire. His long legs eat up the miles with a loping, predatory grace. The red hat is a beacon, a blood drop against the green of the hills. He does not play the frantic, screeching tune that drove the rats to the water. That was a song of panic. This is a song of seduction. It is a lullaby with teeth, weaving a tapestry of sound that promises a land where the sun never sets, where the honey flows from the rock, and where the heavy, crushing expectations of their fathers never reach. It is the music of eternal play, and it strikes a chord in the heart of every child who has ever felt the weight of the adult world pressing down upon them. Behind them, far behind, the chaos of the city spills out onto the road. The parents are running now. The mothers hike up their skirts, stumbling over the ruts, the fathers, red-faced and screaming, sprinting until their lungs burn. Hans, Maria, Heinrich. Their voices are raw, tearing at their throats. They call the names they gave at baptism, the names inscribed in the parish records, but the wind is against them. The wind carries their cries backward, away from the procession. And even if the sound could reach the children, it would not matter. The music has built a wall around them, a fortress of enchantment that no shout can breach. There is a nightmare quality to the pursuit. No matter how fast the parents run, the children seem to remain just out of reach, shimmering in the heat haze like a mirage. The distance does not close. The piper walks, and the gap remains. It is as if the landscape itself is stretching, conspiring with the stranger to widen the chasm between the generation that sinned and the generation that must pay. The parents watch in helpless horror as the line of children snakes away from the river, away from the safety of the valley, and turns south, toward the darkening slopes of the Koppenberg. The Koppenberg, it is not a friendly hill. It looms over the landscape, a brooding mass of limestone and dark woods, a place where the charcoal burners rarely venture and where the old pagan stones still stand in the clearings. It is the boundary of the known world for the people of Hamelin. To go there is to leave civilization behind. The parents see the destination, and a fresh wave of cold terror washes over them. The river took the rats, but the earth is waiting for their sons and daughters. The piper is not leading them to death by water. He is leading them to something far older, something that waits in the hollow places of the world. The song shifts again, deepening, vibrating against the rocks, calling to the stone itself. As the procession begins the ascent, the character of the day changes. The heat of the valley floor gives way to the cool, damp shadow of the pines. The ground beneath their feet turns from soft dust to hard flint. The sound of the flute echoes differently here. It bounces off the limestone cliffs, multiplying, so that it sounds not like one instrument but a choir of invisible pipes singing from the earth itself. The piper does not slow his pace. He leads them toward a depression in the hillside, a place known to the locals as a dead zone, where the grass grows pale and the birds do not nest. It is a scar on the face of the Koppenberg, a geological frown that has watched the valley for millennia. According to the chronicles, and here the ink of history bleeds into the stain of myth, the mountain shuddered. It was not an earthquake that shook the foundations of the world, but a specific, localized convulsion, like a throat opening to swallow. A fissure appeared in the rock face. It was not a cave that had always been there. It was a wound that opened in response to the melody. The stone groaned, a sound of grinding tectonic plates that vibrated in the teeth of the pursuing parents. To their horror, they saw the solid wall of the world part like curtains of heavy gray velvet. The darkness inside was absolute. It was not the inviting shade of a summer arbor. It was the cold, pressurized dark of the deep earth. Yet the children did not recoil. They did not pause to question why the sun had vanished or why the air suddenly smelled of iron and old water. They walked into the maw of the Koppenberg with the same serene confidence with which they had walked out of their homes. The piper led the way, his red hat disappearing into the gloom, his music drawing the line of white tunics after him like a thread being pulled through the eye of a needle. The parents, lungs burning, legs failing, reached the foot of the slope just in time to see the end of the line. They saw the last few children, the stragglers, the smallest ones, step over the threshold of stone. They screamed. They threw themselves up the scree, clawing at the rocks, their fingernails tearing against the flint. "Wait, come back." But the children did not turn. They were listening to a different voice. They stepped into the dark, and the darkness accepted them. And then, with a sound like a thunderclap trapped in a box, the mountain closed. It was instant and irrevocable. There was no slow grinding of gears, no cinematic rumble. One moment there was a passage, the next, there was only the blank, indifferent face of the limestone cliff. The fissure sealed itself so perfectly that not even a seam remained. The moss was undisturbed. The lichen was unbroken. The earth had simply taken back what it had been given. The music stopped instantly, cut off as if a hand had been clamped over the mouth of the flute. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the lungs. The parents stood before the solid rock, gasping, their cries dying in their throats. They touched the stone. It was cold, it was hard, it was real. There was no door, there was no handle. There was only the brutal geology of the Koppenberg standing silent witness to the theft. The sun continued its arc across the sky, indifferent to the tragedy. The 130 children of Hamelin, the pride of the merchants, the heirs of the city, were gone. They had not died, they had vanished. They had been subtracted from the world of men and added to the inventory of the mountain. The piper had collected his debt. He had proven that while gold can be hoarded, life is merely borrowed, and the lender can recall it at any time. Chapter 8. The Three Who Ariamanidi. In the wake of the Great Disappearance, the universe left behind a cruel remainder. The mountain had sealed its stone lips. The road was empty. The parents of Hamelin, exhausted by their grief and their frantic, useless clawing at the limestone cliff, turned their backs to the Koppenberg. They stared down the dusty track they had just ascended, their eyes searching for a ribbon, a shoe, a sign of life. And there, amidst the settling silence, they found the fragments of the tragedy. They found the three who could not follow. Folklore is often kind to survivors. It paints them as the lucky ones, the ones spared by the grace of God. But the Chronicle of Hamelin offers a darker interpretation. The survival of these three children was not a mercy. It was a punctuation mark to the sentence of the town's loss. They were the shards of a mirror that had been shattered, reflecting the event but unable to make it whole. They stood on the road, bewildered and alone, one who could not see, one who could not hear, and one who could not walk. The first was the blind boy. He stood trembling in the middle of the path, his hands outstretched, grasping at the air as if trying to catch the fatting tail of the melody. To him, the tragedy had not been visual. He had not seen the red hat or the opening mountain. He had experienced the event as a sudden, overwhelming infusion of light into his world of darkness. The piper's song had not just been sound, it had been texture. He would later whisper to the scribes that the music felt like the sun upon his face, like the taste of honey, like the sensation of running without fear of stumbling. He had followed the sound because it promised him a world where he did not need eyes to see the beauty. When the mountain closed and the music stopped, his blindness returned with a violence that was physically painful. He was left standing in the cold, absolute dark, crying not for his mother, but for the loss of the vision he had been promised. The second was the deaf boy. He sat by the side of the road, hugging his knees, watching the weeping adults with wide, confused eyes. He had heard nothing, not the flute, not the screams of the parents, not the grinding of the rock. He had seen the procession, yes. He had seen his friends, the other children of the town, walking with that strange, unified joy. He had run after them, desperate to be part of the game, desperate to understand the secret they all seemed to share. But he could not hear the command. He was immune to the enchantment simply because he was broken. He had watched the mountain swallow them in silence, a terrifying pantomime where the earth opened and closed without a whisper. He was the witness to the mechanics of the horror, stripped of its seduction. He saw the piper not as a musician, but as a shepherd leading sheep to the slaughter, his lips moving to a song that did not exist in the boy's world. And then there was the third, the lame boy. He had made it the farthest. He had dragged his twisted leg through the dust, sweating, panting, pushing his body beyond its limits to keep up with the dancing line. He had been close. He had seen the moss on the rocks. He had smelled the damp, iron scent of the cave. But the music had been too fast and his limbs too slow. The door had slammed shut in his face. He lay in the dirt, beating the ground with his fists, cursing the leg that had saved his life. To him, survival was not a gift, it was a rejection. The mountain had taken the strong, the straight, the swift. It had spat him back out because he was imperfect. He looked up at the parents stumbling down the hill, and he saw the look in their eyes, a terrible, fleeting look that asked the question no parent should ever ask. Why you? Why are you here, broken and useless, while my perfect son is gone? These were the witnesses, the sensory fragments of a whole truth that could never be reconstructed. One heard but could not see. One saw but could not hear. One followed but could not finish. Together, they formed a trinity of grief, living monuments to the moment when Hamelin was hollowed out. The parents gathered them up, not with joy, but with a somber, heavy duty. They carried them back down the road to the silent town, leaving the Koppenberg behind to keep its watch over the empty valley. The return to Hamelin was a funeral procession for the living. The sun dipped below the western hills, casting the town in long, bruised shadows that seemed to stretch out from the empty doorways like accusing fingers. When the parents re-entered the gates, those same gates through which their children had danced only hours before, the silence of the city hit them with the physical force of a blow. The workshops were still open. The tools were still where they had been dropped. The half-eaten apples, the spinning tops, the dolls left on the stoops, they were all there, frozen in time, artifacts of a civilization that had been extinguished in a single afternoon. The three survivors were brought to the rat house. They were not treated as children who needed comfort, they were treated as evidence. The mayor and the council, their faces gray with shock, demanded an account. They needed a map. They needed a reason. They needed to know where the tunnel went so they could send men with pickaxes and torches to tear the mountain apart. Scribes were summoned, their quills scratching furiously against parchment, desperate to capture every word, every gasp, every fragmented memory. But the testimony of the three offered no map. It offered only a glimpse of a paradise lost. The blind boy spoke first. He sat in the center of the heavy oak table, his sightless eyes fixed on a point far beyond the stone walls. He spoke of the pleasant land. He described a place where the air smelled of perpetual spring, where the rivers ran with milk, and where there was no sickness and no death. The music told us, he whispered. It said we were going home. The scribes stopped writing. The parents covered their faces. It was the cruelest of revelations, that the children had not been stolen by a monster, but seduced by a better father. They had left because the piper offered them a world that Hamelin, with all its gold and grain, could never provide. The lame boy spoke of the tragedy of the door. He described the terror of the closing rock, the sudden severance of the light. "I saw them go in," he wept. "They did not look back, they were happy." His words hung in the air, a final condemnation of the parents who stood listening. They were happy to leave you. The deaf boy could say nothing, but his drawings, charcoal sketches of a man in a red hat and a mountain with a mouth, were more eloquent than any speech. They depicted a force of nature, an inevitability that could not be bargained with. As the years passed, the three survivors grew into men, but they never truly belonged to Hamelin again. They were the living ghosts of the city, walking reminders of the debt that had been paid. The blind man sat by the church, listening for a tune that never returned. The deaf man worked in silence, watching the lips of the townspeople move in prayer. The lame man hobbled through the streets, enduring the bitter glances of mothers who looked at his twisted leg and thought, "Why you? Why did the mountain spit you out when it kept my strong, beautiful son?" They lived their lives in the shadow of the Koppenberg. They were the ones who were left behind, and in the peculiar, tragic calculus of Hamelin, they carried a burden heavier than those who vanished. The vanished found a new world, or perhaps oblivion. The survivors had to live in the empty house, listening to the echo of the laughter that would never return. Chapter 9. The Echoes of the East. When we strip the flesh of the fairy tale from the bones of history, we are left with a skeleton that is less magical, perhaps, but no less tragic. We must put away the image of the sorcerer and the mountain that yawns like a mouth. We must look instead at the map of Europe in the 13th century, a map that was bleeding at the edges, expanding and tearing as humanity pushed against its own boundaries. If the piper was not a demon sent from hell, and if the mountain was not a portal to a hollow earth, then what was he? The archives suggest a figure far more common to the era, yet equally dangerous to a settled community. He was likely a locator, a recruiter, a headhunter, a man paid in silver to harvest the most valuable crop of all, people. The year 1284 falls squarely within the period of the Ostsiedlung, the great eastern expansion of the German-speaking peoples. To the east, in the wild lands of Moravia, Pomerania, and Transylvania, the local counts and bishops were desperate. They had vast tracts of forest and swamp, but no hands to clear them, no backs to build their cathedrals, no taxpayers to fill their coffers. And so, they sent out agents. These locators traveled west to the crowded, teeming cities of Lower Saxony, cities like Hamelin where the population had outgrown the land. They wore bright, garish clothing, not because they were wizards, but because they needed to be seen in the market square. They played drums and flutes not to cast a spell, but to gather a crowd, much like a town crier or a carnival barker. Look at the children of Hamelin again through this lens. The chronicle calls them puri children, but in the legal language of the Middle Ages, children of the town did not necessarily mean toddlers clutching teddy bears. It often referred to the children of the citizens, the youth, the unmarried, the second and third sons who had no inheritance, the daughters with no dowries. Hamelin was a city of stone walls, and walls limit growth. There was no land left inside the gates. For the young generation, the future in Hamelin promised only servitude, overcrowding, and the eternal shadow of their father's success. They were a surplus population, hungry for a life that the city could not give them. Enter the piper. He stands in the square, a charismatic stranger with a glib tongue and a pocket full of promises. He does not sing of a candy land inside a hill. He sings of the East. He sings of the 7 castles of Transylvania, where the land is free for the taking, where a man can own the soil he tills, where a serf can become a master. To the disenfranchised youth of Hamelin, this was not just a song. It was a revolution. It was an offer of liberation. The enchantment was not magic. It was the intoxicating, blinding hope of a better life. The trance was the collective decision of a generation to walk away from a society that had no room for them. And so the exodus begins. It is not a kidnapping but a migration. Yet to the parents left behind, those merchants who measured their wealth in legacy, it was a theft of the highest order. Their workforce, their heirs, their old age insurance simply walked out the gate. The parents could not accept that their children chose to leave. It was too painful to believe that their sons and daughters preferred the unknown hardships of the wild East to the safety of home. So they invented a story. They invented a monster. They claimed their children were stolen by magic, because that was easier to bear than the truth, that their children had simply outgrown them. If the earth did not swallow them, then the map must reveal them. History leaves fingerprints, faint whorls of identity pressed into the clay of foreign lands, waiting for the patient eye to find them. If we follow the ghost road of the Ostsiedlung east, past the dark forests of Bohemia and over the jagged spine of the Carpathian Mountains, we arrive in the region known as Transylvania or Siebenbürgen, the Seven Fortresses. Here, thousands of miles from the river Weser, we find a strange anomaly. We find villages built with the same timber-framed precision as the houses of Lower Saxony. We find blue eyes and fair hair. And most haunting of all, we find a language, a dialect of German, preserved in the amber of isolation, that bears the unmistakable cadence of the Hamelin streets. Linguists who study the Saxon dialect of Transylvania have found words that exist nowhere else but in the archives of the Weser Valley. They are linguistic fossils, carried in the mouths of the immigrants across a continent. Place names in East Prussia and Poland echo the names of the families recorded in the Hamelin town books: Hamelspring, Hamel, Poppenberg. It is a trail of breadcrumbs made of stone and syntax. The children did not vanish into thin air. They vanished into a new geography. They walked until their shoes fell apart, until the memories of the rat catcher and the broken oath faded into a nursery rhyme, told to their own children to explain why they had come so far. But consider the tragedy of this reality. In the 13th century, distance was absolute. There was no post, no telegraph. To walk to Transylvania was to walk off the edge of the known world. When the 130 crossed the horizon, they were, for all intents and purposes, dead to their parents. The silence that fell over Hamelin was not the silence of a magical mystery. It was the silence of total severance. The mother waiting by the window in Hamelin would never know that her son had survived the journey. She would never know that he had cleared a forest, built a house, and fathered a new generation. She would die believing he was lost in the dark of the mountain. The piper, then, transforms from a demon into a catalyst. He was the agent of a historical necessity, the knife that cut the cord between the stagnant past and the brutal future. He led the surplus youth away from a city that could not feed them to a land that needed them. It was a transaction of blood and soil. The magic was simply the charisma required to convince a generation to abandon everything they knew. The mountain that opened was likely a pass through the hills, the threshold between the safety of the German lands and the wild frontier of the East. Yet even stripped of its magic, the story retains its horror, for it speaks to the ultimate fear of every parent, the realization that their children are not their property. It speaks to the terrifying moment when the young realize they can walk away, and that no amount of parental love or authority can stop them. The children of Hamelin became the ancestors of the Transylvanian Saxons, but to do so, they had to orphan their own parents. They had to commit an act of collective abandonment. The echo of the East is the sound of a new life being built on the ruins of an old bond. The children survived, yes, but Hamelin died. The city continued to exist, stones upon stones, but its heart, its future, its youth, its continuity, had been transplanted to a foreign soil, leaving behind only a street where music is forbidden and a story that refuses to heal. Chapter 10: The Street of Silence. We return now to where we began, to the coordinates of the wound. We stand once more on the cobblestones of the Bungelosenstrasse, the street without drums. It is the 21st century. The air is no longer thick with the smell of medieval tanneries or unwashed wool. It smells of coffee, diesel, and the faint, sugary scent of the tourist trade. Hamelin today is a city of neon and glass, a modern node in the German economy. Cars idle at traffic lights. Smartphones capture the facade of the old timber-framed houses. The Pied Piper has become a mascot, a logo stamped on coffee mugs and keychains, a colorful caricature used to sell ice cream and guided tour. The trauma of 1284 has been sanitized, packaged, and sold back to the world as a fairy tale. Yet if you step away from the souvenir shops and walk down this specific, narrow artery of the town, the modern world seems to hold its breath. The law remains. It is an unwritten statute, etched not in the municipal code but in the collective psyche of the inhabitants. No music here. No bride may walk down this street accompanied by a violin. No parade may march here with a beating drum. Even the tourists, chattering in a dozen languages, seem to lower their voices instinctively when they enter the shadow of the overhanging gables. The silence of the Bungelosenstrasse is not an absence of noise. It is a memorial. It is the scar tissue that forms over a deep laceration, tough, hairless, and distinct from the surrounding skin. Look up at the facade of the Rattenfänger house, the rat catcher's house. It is a magnificent structure of the Renaissance, built long after the tragedy, yet it bears the burden of the memory. Inscribed on a wooden beam on the side of the house, painted in gold letters that catch the fading light, is the epitaph of a generation. A.D. 1284, on the 26th of June, the day of St. John and St. Paul, 130 children, born in Hamelin, were led out of the town by a piper wearing all kinds of colors, and lost at the execution place near the hill. It is a chillingly specific indictment. It does not speak of once upon a time. It gives a date. It gives a count. It gives a location. This is not the language of myth. It is the language of a police report filed 7 centuries too late. The inscription stands as a defiant correction to the storybooks. It reminds us that before the piper was a character in a nursery rhyme, he was a trauma. Before the children were symbols of innocence lost, they were flesh and blood, sons and daughters who woke up one morning, put on their shoes, and never came home. The house stands as a witness, a stone sentinel that refuses to let the city forget the price of its broken oath. The tragedy of Hamelin is that it is a city defined by what is missing. Most cities build monuments to their victories, statues of generals, arches of triumph. Hamelin is built around a void. The center of its history is a hole, a zero, a subtraction. The silence of the Bungelosenstrasse is the negative space where the laughter should be. It is a street haunted not by ghosts, but by the potential of the lives that were never lived here. The unwritten symphonies, the unbuilt houses, the unborn descendants of the 130, they are all gathered here, invisible and silent, pressing against the windows of the present. Why does this story endure? Why, after 7 centuries of wars, plagues, and revolutions, do we still return to the small town in Lower Saxony to count its missing children? It is not because of the rats. The rats are merely the prelude, the vermin we can see to distract us from the vermin we cannot. We return to Hamelin because it terrifies us with a specific, uncomfortable truth, that the world is transactional and that there is a cosmic ledger that cannot be cheated. We live in an age that loves the broken promise. We sign contracts we intend to alter. We incur debts we intend to ignore. We speak words that evaporate as soon as they leave our lips. We believe, like the mayor in his high chair, that power grants us immunity from consequence. But the piper is the shadow that stands in the corner of every room where a lie is told. He is not a villain in the traditional sense. He is not a monster who destroys for pleasure. He is an agent of equilibrium. He represents the terrifying neutrality of justice. He performed a service. He demanded a wage. When the wage was denied, he did not argue. He did not file a complaint. He simply repossessed the collateral. The horror of the story is not that the piper was cruel, but that he was fair. He took exactly what was owed, calculated against the only currency that truly matters, the future. The lesson of the empty street is that we do not own our children, nor do we own our prosperity. These things are loans entrusted to us by the earth and by time. If we violate the terms of that trust, if we become consumed by greed, if we value the gold in the vault more than the breath in the cradle, then the loan is recalled. The mountain opens, the road calls, the music starts. As the sun sets over the Weser one last time, casting the long, distorted shadows of the timber houses across the water, listen closely. Ignore the noise of the traffic and the hum of the modern city. Listen to the wind as it comes down from the Koppenberg Hills. There is a frequency there, low and rhythmic, vibrating against the glass of the windows. Some say it is just the weather. Others, those who know the history of the silence, know better. The piper never truly left Hamelin. He is waiting in the spaces between our promises. He is walking the perimeter of every city that believes it is too rich to fail, fingering the worn wood of his flute, waiting for the moment when the debt becomes too heavy to bear. The candle is burning low now. The archives must close. But before you blow out the light, ask yourself, what have you promised? What have you forgotten? And if the music were to start tonight, playing the song of your deepest, most secret desire, would you be able to stop yourself from following? Keep your promises, pay the piper, for the mountain is always waiting and the door once closed never opens again.